Good afternoon, everyone. Woo! Almost buenos aires. Like all of the keynoters, I'm going to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart. And I think the interesting thing in all the keynotes was that there was this one underlying theme that kind of wasn't said, but all of these incredible technologies that were discussed and the things that are changing the world were largely powered by open source. In my previous role, I kickstarted the open source and developer community around a product called Cloudify, and then I moved up the stack and became the head of marketing. And I quickly understood what's involved, the trials and tribulations and the challenges involved with building a successful and sustainable open source project. And I guess the thing that I want you guys to take away from this talk today is why this should even matter to you. Why should you care? So let's start. Free software, also known as Libre software, open source software rebranded by Red Hat in the late 90s, made it easier for people of all demographics to learn to code, making technology accessible to the world. Open source technology democratized the world of technology. It changed the world. If formerly technology was really just the privilege of an exclusive caste, suddenly it was accessible to everyone. Really made it possible for everyone to become a part of technology. Jonno Bacon, I lost my clicker, sorry. Jonno Bacon, the former head of community at Ubuntu, tells a really great story. You should hear him tell it firsthand. He told it at DevOps Days Tel Aviv 2018. He tells a story of a young African man who sent him an email. Ubuntu means the virtues of humanity and compassion in Zulu. And this young African man was so attached to the name of this project that he would do chores around the village every week to make some earnings. And then he would walk 2.5 hours in the blistering sun to the closest internet cafe. It would buy him about 2 hours of internet time so he could contribute code to the Ubuntu project. That's how much the open source code is changing the world. And we don't have to look as far as Africa. We have Diego Rodriguez, who told a similar story in his talk today. He said, I am an open source advocate because open source technology had the power to change my life for the better. Did I get it right? Yeah. Okay. And this is what open source technology made possible. I'm Sharone Zitzman. I, too, am an open source advocate. In my day job, I'm the head of developer relations at AppsFlyer, the foremost mobile attribution and marketing analytics platform in the world. And I am also a serial open source community builder. I don't build them alone, of course. I have partners and peers that help me do this, but I helped build from the ground up the DevOps community in Israel, the OpenStack community in Israel, the Cloud Native community in Israel. And as far back as 2017, I could see where the wind was blowing. And at the OpenStack Summit 2017, I did a panel called The Amazon Effect on Open Source Cloud Business Models. And this was an especially harrowing year in the world of open source, where some of the most popular technologies, some of the most popular open source projects have been changing their licenses, have been locking down their code as a result of some of the industry trends that have been happening. In my previous capacity, I was the head of marketing, and this is a position that is constantly looking to make revenue and make the project more sustainable. And I was in this constant split brain of needing to build a developer community and reconcile that with the business aspects, and that's a very, very difficult role to hold. Today, I'm in developer relations, and I can go all in on building developer communities. And when Amazon announced the open distro for Elasticsearch, I came out with a post called What the Fork Amazon, because I think that this has the potential of being very destructive for the open source industry as a whole. So that's me, and why open source is important to me. Okay, so goals from this session, what I hope you will take away from this session. I want to paint as vivid a picture as possible of the complexities involved with building a sustainable and successful open source project, what the landscape looks like, the ecosystem, what sustainability even means. What does this mean? And what are the primary business models that support sustainability? And eventually, like I said, why this should matter to you. Okay. So like Massimiliano, who told the history of JavaScript, I'm going to tell a brief history of the open source industry as quickly as I can, because it's a rich history. There are people that built this, this ecosystem from the ground up and made this fundamental shift possible. A lot of us were born into open source, but a lot went into actually building this. So, anyone recognize this guy? Yes. Shout it out when you know it. Shout it out. That is correct. Ding, 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 we have a winner. You've earned a T-shirt afterwards. Okay, so Richard Stallman, the founder of the Free Software Foundation, like I said, free is not, doesn't mean the price tag, free as in speech, not beer, the Free Software Foundation, and the GNU project. Like they say, Linux is free if your time is worthless. But this was the result of trends that happened in the decades before that. In the 50s and 60s, hardware was procured, and it largely came tightly coupled with a software stack. So you bought a monolithic proprietary hardware stack with its software. Early 70s, Unix-based, POSIX-based system came along, and hardware and software were decoupled. Suddenly you could run software on commodity hardware, and the corporations rolling out this software understood that they were sitting on a gold mine, and they started to lock down their software and attach proprietary, very costly licenses to these software stacks. And Richard Stallman was in academia at the time, and academia was kind of the first, I guess we'll call it GitHub or collaborative place where software was shared and collaborated upon and innovated upon. And he could see that this would be a huge hindrance to progress and innovation. And he knew that he needed to do something to make a change. So he kickstarted the Free Software Foundation, where this has also caused a common misconception that the idea is free. But in Italian, like in Hebrew, there's a separate word for free, gratis, and free, libertà. So the idea is libertà. It's the liberty of sharing software. GNU being recursive for GNU, not Unix. Very dorkily. Okay, so what open source, the core fundamentals of open source technology. It's supposed to enable you to run the program as you wish for any purpose. Study how the program works and change it. Redistribute copies to help others. Distribute copies of your modified version. And over the course of the last year, like I said, where there were a lot of changes in the open source industry, the Free Software Foundation, the OSI, the Open Source Initiative came out and reaffirmed this definition of open source. But this definition of open source has its gaps. Many of the companies that are born in open source, whose core values are in open source, but they need to find a monetization angle to be self-sustaining, find that this doesn't cover them sufficiently from a licensing perspective. Now, the primary goal of the GNU project and the Free Software Foundation was to provide truly viable, robust enough solutions, alternatives to proprietary and costly software stacks. So along comes Linus Torvalds, early 90s, and founds the Linux kernel. There's a common misconception that Linux is an operating system. It is not. It's a kernel, and many operating systems are built around it. So there's GNU Linux, there's Debian, Fedora, Ubuntu, and this provided a truly viable alternative to costly operating systems. Apache, web server, Nginx, alternatives to Microsoft web servers. Mozilla is the fork of Netscape. Once Netscape went under, they forked the code and made it open source, provided a viable alternative to Internet Explorer being free, but not open source, like we said. There are many technologies that are closed source and free. That is not what we're referring to when we talk about free technology like VMware ESX or drivers or Internet Explorer. We're talking about, when we say free software, what is classified as open source based on the definition we previously defined. Android and iOS. Databases, the large majority of databases today are provided open source, MongoDB, MySQL, Postgres, ScyllaDB, a million others. MySQL, interesting story, after it started becoming successful, Oracle bought MySQL, and the community was stressed by this move, and they forked MySQL to a separate community called MariaDB, also an open source database. And even Amazon Web Services comes out, and then projects like OpenSolaris, OpenStack, CloudStack attempted to provide open cloud solutions. And Kubernetes, interesting story, is a commoditization play by Google. They wanted to attempt to move workloads into Google Cloud, so they built Kubernetes. Google is well known in the open source industry. They offered this free and open governance. They contributed to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and they provided the first managed service around Kubernetes in order to move more workloads into their cloud. And all of these technologies together created a true cookie-cutter, viable alternative to proprietary and costly stacks. And the LAMP stack was really the driver of building more workloads and more technologies, and it essentially made it exponentially easier, less expensive, and more rapid to roll out technology. And the interesting thing is that because of the exponential growth in workloads, suddenly a new alternative to hardware and servers was needed. And this was actually what spurred virtualization and cloud, because there were so many workloads being created. So the irony of the cloud providers being the biggest threat to open source is essentially like biting the hand that feeds them. So this is what open source made possible: build versus buy. Instead of having to use these closed shelfware proprietary stacks that what you see is what you get, that's it. This is what you can do with it. It doesn't really leave you much room for innovation. Open source technology provided building blocks to innovate, and it was really the driver for innovation. A really good example is from the talk yesterday by Anna Bax and Christina Zentzes, where they talked about the smart building that they built, and the large majority of the building blocks that they used were open protocols and open source libraries and technologies. If they spoke about OpenHAB and KNX and MQTT and OpenStack, and they're even thinking to migrate to Kubernetes. The largest web-scale companies, the internet giants today, are investing in really good engineers, because engineers want to be working on the most exciting and bleeding-edge stacks. And these stacks are largely built on open source technology, because open source technology is the intelligence of the masses. So once open source projects started taking off, they needed to find a viable way to sustain these projects in the long term, and that's when foundations came around. You can imagine the projects that the Linux Foundation and the Apache Software Foundation hosted. But once they started finding a repeatable and successful model to maintain these projects, providing financial services, legal services, licensing around these projects, they started to welcome new projects into these foundations. So the Linux Foundation and the Apache Software Foundation actually incubate new projects, and once they graduate, they become their own standalone projects. The Linux Foundation hosts KVM and Android and many other large-scale projects alongside the Linux kernel. Apache Software Foundation, if you've heard of Apache Spark or Hadoop, Kafka, these are all hosted by the Apache Software Foundation on top of their web server. The Cloud Native Computing Foundation is even a sub-foundation of the Linux Foundation. They spun off another foundation, and that is the place that Kubernetes and Containerd are hosted. And so this has been a very successful model. Some are very technology-specific, like the Python Foundation. OpenStack Foundation was also very technology-specific, and they just graduated 2 projects, Zool and Kata Containers. So this has been a very successful model for maintaining open source in the long term. So just so we're aligned on terminology, has that been a lot to take in? You can say yes. We're only at the beginning. OK. OK, so just so we're aligned on terminology, many times we'll hear the terms upstream, fork, downstream in the world of open source. So I'm just going to clarify a little bit about what that means. The upstream release is the vanilla release released by the foundation that hosts the project. It's then forked. Having a delay on my clicker. OK. It's then forked by companies looking to provide a layer on top, whether it's their own specific operating system, feature-based, production-grade support, whatever it is. Then they roll out what's called a downstream release. If there are additions to the open source core that they make, like security and patches and things like that, sometimes they contribute that back to the upstream release, the next release that will come out from the foundation. It's kind of like oil and gas. So oil is the upstream release, and then gas is what's refined, and that's what we get. Okay, so this is just a brief timeline of the open source projects and the ones that have been released since the late 90s till today. It's a purposely very, very messy slide, but just so you get some context of the amount of projects that have been released since the late 90s and the kickstart of the GNU project. And these are the amounts of workloads that have been pushed into the cloud, many of them. And this is only a partial snapshot. And this is the growth in the amount of open source licenses from GitHub and Black Duck, where MIT, like I said, where Richard Stallman was from, is probably the most popular open source license. There's Apache 2 from the Apache Software Foundation, GPL from the GNU project, AGPL is their more restrictive license, and we can see that from 2008 onwards, there's just been exponential growth in open source software. But I want to venture a hypothesis. Since I couldn't find the data, so it's only a hypothesis, I couldn't back this up with any data. But I feel like this is stagnating now. I think it's stagnating because commercial open source companies they need to raise capital for the first few years of their existence in order to be able to build a successful business model, to build a developer community, to remain relevant. And when I was at my previous company, a question that I was often asked as the VP marketing was, well, what prevents AWS from swooping right in and reaping the rewards of your hard work? And there was no simple answer to this question. The licenses today just currently don't provide enough coverage for this not to happen. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the landscape. So on top of that, we have the landscape. We have the house innovators, I call them, like your peer companies that are also producing innovative technologies that are similar to your own. They're providing features and other things that you might not have thought about. And you have to remain relevant, provide excellent technology while sustaining your open source code, while sustaining your open source community. House incumbents, that's the companies with the deep pockets that can offer software bundles for free of seemingly related technologies. And like they say, no one ever got fired for buying IBM. And then there's the house giants that see the success of your projects and they want a piece of the pie too. And this is the constant mindset you need to be in. I don't know who to attribute this quote to. I tried to find it. I thought it was Steve Jobs. It's not. I don't know. Disrupt yourself before someone else does. This is what you have to be thinking all the time when you're navigating through this complex landscape. You have to continue innovating. You have to continue maintaining your community while fending off, the threats from every single direction. And then there's this thing that I call the vicious disruption cycle. Once you start to build hype, you start to monetize, build a developer community, boom, a new and more exciting technology comes out. So VMware comes out, boom, Amazon, disruptor. Puppet, boom, Chef, Ansible, SaltStack. Boom, Cloudera, Hortonworks, OpenStack, and then all of the container technologies, Kubernetes and Docker and CoreOS and Mesosphere, and all of these technologies come out. And this is what you're up against. And on top of that, once you become this exciting and flourishing community, comes along the cloud provider, wraps a managed service around your product, and sells it without contributing one line of code back to your community. And so I say to you, you need to be very afraid, because the large majority of the services that we consume, the critical infrastructure that we are using is running on open source code. And the people maintaining this code are crumbling under the burden. We don't have to look much further than the NPM left pad disaster to understand how fragile it all is. the maintainers of the Python community. This is oftentimes the case with programming languages that don't have any realistic commercial model around them. So the maintainers of the Python community have been very vocal about their burnout. If it's Jesse Noller and Brett Cannon, and these people take from their personal lives, their personal time, and they maintain these projects just for the intrinsic motivation it provides. I want to read you a short excerpt. Nolan Lawson, who also many times live streams his open source maintenance, he wrote this blog post, and I urge you all to read also the article that I mentioned in the previous slide, Roads and Bridges, the Unseen Labor Behind Our Digital Infrastructure, and this blog post called A Day in the Life of an Open Source Maintainer. Outside your door stands a line of a few hundred people. They are patiently waiting for you to answer their questions, complaints, pull requests, and feature requests. You want to help all of them, but for now, you're putting it off. Maybe you had a hard day at work, or you're tired, or you're just trying to enjoy a weekend with your family and friends. This is what it's like to be an open source maintainer. And this is what they get in return. Liran Tal, shout out to my friend Liran, who actually introduced me to this conference and brought me here. Open source maintainer, project as old as 2007, stopped development in 2012. I replied to the email within 15 minutes while traveling on a Friday night at 1:30 a.m. And the person replied, "Thanks for nothing." Snipe, I don't know, Mother of Dragons or something on Twitter. I'm totally bummed out of this inexplicable omission of this feature, no action or even substantive comments for a year. We've pushed 580 commits to master this year. If it's that important to you, we would welcome a pull request. I've been around long enough in open source to understand the hype cycles and the trolls, but it still causes heartache and demotivation. These are the people maintaining your projects. They're doing it for the sole purpose of being all in on this and providing something back to the community. And this is oftentimes what they run into, this thanklessness and this snark and this disparaging, instead of being extremely thankful for the contributions they do. So together, 1, 2, 3, I want us to say thank you to the people maintaining open source projects. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Thank you. Yes, thank you to these angels maintaining open source projects, because we need to incentivize them. We need them maintaining these projects, because otherwise these projects would not exist. And this is to give you some perspective. This is the graph of what it looks like when an open source project becomes successful. The first few months are usually the core committers, pushes to master. But then when there's an uptick in popularity in an open source project, there's a hockey stick that goes whoosh right up into the sky of pushes and pull requests and feature requests and issues and comments on this GitHub repo. And that's a month-by-month timeline of the amount of that they need to deal with in order to maintain a successful community and open source project. This should give you some perspective. And so I'd like to tell you a fable. Any sci-fi nerds here? I'm a big sci-fi nerd. Anyone? Raise your hand. Anyone read Walk Away by Cory Doctorow or Snow Crash, Ready Player One? Okay, I want you to close your eyes and imagine a dystopian future, a future where everything is taken over by corporations or franchises. In Snow Crash, even countries and armies were privatized and owned. And you're a pawn, you're a little indentured servant at one of these corporations, and you decide, I'm walking away, like in Cory Doctorow. A bunch of people get together and they say, we want to build a better community, an open community, a collaborative community. So they go out into the wilderness and they start building these structures. And people start flooding in. They say, okay, we want to be a part of this community. And they come and take a look at these really simple structures that they made, and they say, well, I want curtains, and I want a balcony, and I want red paint. The people who built the community, they're patient, they're trying their best, and they say, well, we're working on electricity and running water right now. And the people are like, oh, this is horrible, we hate this. This is worthless. And then imagine that suddenly you hear a tractor backing right in, beep, 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 and the corporations come in. They hear of this successful and flourishing community, and they say, well, there's no real estate deed here, so I'm going to start selling these structures. Will this village survive? So let's talk about sustainability. What makes open source projects sustainable? What makes them self-sustaining? So like I said, there's the commercial open source model of open source. These are largely the companies that are kickstarted by a founder with an excellent idea with core values in open source. The closest thing that I can relate this to is like social entrepreneurship, where you want to do something good for mankind, but you have to have a profitable company. You have a startup around this, and you want to build a business model in order to be able to provide this service for mankind. So medical innovations and environmental innovations have all been built around the same kind of idea. These companies usually have to raise capital in order for them to become self-sustaining until they build their community, like I said, until they build their business model. The next kind of business model is what's called a distribution model, usually a foundation-hosted project, like I said, that's released to Upstream. Companies fork it. They provide some kind of monetization layer on top, if it's production-grade support, if it's added features that they monetize on, and they release this as a distribution. And then there's the open and individual contributor-supported projects that are widely adopted, that are literally maintained by people just in the community. These are the ones that are most problematic. So commercial open source companies, I'm just going to tell you a little bit. I'm going to give you some examples of the different kinds of projects. This is a quote from Shai Banan's post. The original writer of Elasticsearch, who built the company Elastic, in response to AWS's open distro for Elasticsearch. This is the first few lines of his post. In 2009, I sat down and wrote the first few lines of Elasticsearch and open sourced it. I quit my job and spent 2 years investing in building the product and fostering the amazing community that has been built around it. In 2012, we formed a company, Elastic, around it. This is what goes into building a commercial open source company. Many times they quit their jobs, they go all in, and they believe in this thing, this dream of this open source project that they want to keep offering to the world, but they know they need to be a self-sustaining company. Undermining the commitment to open source of these companies, saying making open source more open, is dubious, to say the least. So like I said, poster children Elastic, HashiCorp, also a well-known company that's similar, Redis. And Elastic recently had a very successful IPO that validated the need for open source and the way that open source can be monetized and sustained. They went out on their IPO at a $36 market share price, and they closed the day at almost double that price. They had a very successful IPO, which is great news for open source. The other type of open source company is the distribution model, like I said. So Databricks is a distribution of Apache Spark. They provide production-grade Apache Spark. Confluent, interesting story. Confluent is the production-grade version of Kafka. The core writers, the founders of Kafka, left LinkedIn after submitting it to the Apache Software Foundation. They left LinkedIn and built a company to be able to provide production-grade Kafka, one of the most popular event streaming, data streaming technologies, the core piece of AppsFlyer technology. We're speaking at Kafka Summit next week. And Heptio, also the core founders of Kubernetes, the core writers of Kubernetes, the first production-grade Kubernetes, also snatched up very quickly. But then there's the other side of open source. Projects like OpenSSL, that when the Heartbleed vulnerability came to pass, suddenly this Pandora's box was opened. And when they looked inside, they saw that just a handful of people were supporting this project that was being used by millions, by the largest corporations in the world. And suddenly they understood that maybe some open source projects that don't have a commercial viable model around them need to be supported in a corporate responsibility format. So IBM and Intel and Microsoft and Facebook and Google came around and decided to do a better job of supporting OpenSSL. But this is not the only project like that. There's curl and many others that we're all using on a regular basis, NPM modules, many others that don't have a viable commercial model around them. And we need to think about how we can help keep them going. Let's talk a little bit about the license wars. So like I said, this was an especially harrowing year in the context of open source. And remember this guy, Richard Stallman. So Richard Stallman only believes in that definition of open source, something that's called copyleft, where everything you've written can be redistributed and commercialized. He's unwilling to say that or the Free Software Foundation or the Open Source Initiative that possibly, maybe they can add a clause of not commercializing on these projects because a lot of blood, sweat, and tears goes into building these projects. And that is the only viable way for them to remain self-sustaining. And so over the course of the last year, some of the most popular projects have been locking down their code, have been attaching more closed licenses, and this is not a good thing. MongoDB, that was formerly AGPL, one of the more restrictive open source licenses, now is SSPL. Redis, alongside Neo4j and a bunch of others, added the Commons clause to their open source project in order for not to be commercializable, I don't think that's a word, but be able to commercialize on their product. Chef recently changed their business model. They came out with a post that said, we're going as open source as it gets, but the fine print was that they changed their business model, and they are now pricing by binary, similar to Red Hat. And I actually think this is a brilliant move, and I'll touch on why in a minute. Confluent as well, the company behind Kafka, like I said, also changed their license this year. Elastic was one of the first that changed their license. They have a proprietary license. It's free software, but it's not, some of it is only source available. What's called source available. And there's been carnage. It is bloody waters out there. Some of the most popular projects are not managing to sustain themselves. They've been shutting down. They have not managed to find a viable business model. And this is not good for any of us. NPM, any of you guys using NPM? NPM is struggling. Some of these companies have a mildly successful business model. This is not something that will help them be maintained in the long term. Let's stop and think for a minute. What would our life look like without NPM? Possibly something else could come around, but until it's built, until the number of packages and things that are available there, it would be complete heartache for these projects to not exist. It would change everything. It would make everything much more difficult, take much longer, much more expensive to build. Okay. So let's talk a bit about AWS. AWS, some would claim, is the most successful open source company in the world because they do a really good job of monetizing on open source. Albeit, they don't do much about giving back to the community. They have found a repeatable and excellent business model around open source without really having to lift a finger. And then in March, they come out with this post, making open source more open. The flagship of open source contribution, Amazon. So this was received with a bit of disdain. And as a result, the many companies that I previously mentioned that have been changing their licenses over the course of the last year have decided to align themselves with Google Cloud and run natively on Google Cloud. And this is because Google is a first-class citizen in the open source world. We don't have to look much farther than Kubernetes and Android and even programming languages like Go and Angular. What they can, the technology side is not their core business. So whatever they can, they release as open source to the community, many times open governance. Even their competitors wrap services around their projects like Kubernetes, and they're fine with that because they are first-class open source citizens. Microsoft is an interesting story. And you mentioned in your talk, in your keynote, Microsoft recently contributing 125 million visuals of AI back to the community. Microsoft, in its early years, took a very strong anti-open source stance. It was very hard for them to shake that off because they saw Linux operating systems, and the open source web servers as very threatening to their core business. But they have changed that. They are now becoming more natively integrated with Linux and many other projects. They open source, aside from that, they open sourced 60,000 of their patents this year, just this year alone. And GitHub, a Microsoft company, now a Microsoft company. And the interesting story behind GitHub is many times people think they bought GitHub to espouse other communities. That is not the reason they bought GitHub. GitHub themselves were having difficulties finding a viable business model. And they did not want all of that open source code to be lost to the world. And they bought GitHub to sustain GitHub in the long term. And GitHub has even made moves to make some of their formerly proprietary features free, like private repos. And the Apache Software Foundation demonstrated their trust in Microsoft and have moved all of their projects to GitHub. And this is what it looks like. This is the map of open source contributions. This is why companies are trusting in Google and Microsoft. The top right-hand corner is the number of committers to open source from these companies. That's Microsoft and Google. Let's look for Amazon. Anybody see it? Oh, there they are. Isn't that cute? Oh, look at you. All right, that's Amazon. Amazon is not known to be a first-class citizen in the world of open source. Facebook is a larger contributor to open source than Amazon. Red Hat, much smaller company. Red Hat actually do support many projects in the format of corporate responsibility, ones they don't even monetize on, because they are an open source company. And there have been additional house alliances, we'll call them. The companies that I said formerly, the house incumbents, they realized that in order to stay relevant, in order to continue innovating themselves, they have doubled down on open source technology over the course of the last year. IBM, no one ever got fired for buying IBM or Red Hat. So IBM purchased Red Hat for $34 billion. Woo! Woo for open source. That was a big win for open source. Red Hat being the first billion-dollar open source company. F5 acquires Nginx. VMware acquires Kubernetes. And this is not in order to close source these code. It is in order to remain more relevant in an open source world where they found that they were lagging behind, that they weren't being seen as innovative. And I'm going to stop here for a minute because that was a lot to take in. And although he stole my thunder yesterday, I'm going to give out some T-shirts. T-shirt. I don't know. Wait. Huh? What size T-shirt do you want? Medium. T-shirts. T-shirts. You guys can trade if they're not the right sizes. Medium. Anyone? Medium. Great. Let me see what I got here. Medium?
Yeah, sure.
We'll find a... Wait. Here, large. Right. Large. Medium. Yours. Large women. Women. Go. Yours. Yes. That was a good catch. Large women's. Anyone. Done. Yours. Large women's. There's so few women in the room. Men medium. Done. Women small woman. Yes. Yours, sorry. Another small woman. Give me another small woman. Little lady. Large men's. Medium men. Oh, sorry. Well, that's large men's. Large. Yours. Last but not least, men's medium. Yours, because you're close and it's easy. And I'm tired. Women's small. Last women's. Yours. Sold to the highest bidder. Only because I want you to shake it off, because that was a lot. That was overwhelming. Because this is the most important part. I want you to understand why it all matters. Why does this all matter? So what? Corporate wars, licenses, moguls, I don't care. You know, I have my, my projects that I use, whatever. But it does matter because open source is making the impossible possible. And before I reference CERN, I'm going to talk about the medical, how it's pushing the frontiers of medical research in the talk that Gant gave, where it could change his mother's life. And the accessibility it can provide, because the Google APIs that, that Tony used yesterday were also open source. It is pushing the frontiers of science, medicine, everything, technology. And CERN, the Center for Nuclear Research, they're running, and this is from a talk that Tim Bell gave probably 2 years ago at OpenStack Day Tel Aviv. So I imagine that they've had exponential growth in the amount of data and research that they are running. 8,000 servers, more than 280,000 cores, 33,000 VMs, all on OpenStack. This would not be possible on closed proprietary cloud. We want them to be doing this research. CERN also serves as an architectural reference for academia and other nonprofit organizations. We want organizations to be able to understand how to build open source stacks. So this is extremely important. An open source project can say it's pretty successful when it's enabling millions to create new things or do what they previously could not. I think this is extremely important for mankind, for the progress we're talking about. It really has the power to change the world. Oops. We want open source to be self-sustaining. We want to enable a marketplace of profitability around open source because maintaining developer mindshare over an extended period of time is extremely difficult. Maintaining excellent code over an extended period of time is an extremely costly operation. And many companies, many really good open source companies, ScyllaDB, I like to give them a shout out, or a company based out of Herzliya, Tel Aviv in Israel. And they're the same writers as KVM. And they're oftentimes asked, are you committed to keeping your projects open source? And they say, yes, of course. But this is no simple operation, and there are no free lunches. In order to be able to do this, they need to be self-sustaining. And I like Chef. I like their change in their license because it's really interesting. Let's look at number 2. They say, okay, sure, you can take our open source projects, you can fork it, and you can maintain it yourself. You can add the features, the security, the production grade support that you need, run it yourself. Because they know everything that's involved in maintaining this excellent project. And this is only one tool in your stack. Think if you had to do this for all of the tools in your stack. So they say, yeah, go right ahead. Only 1% done. This is something we like to say at AppsFlyer to remind ourselves where we are in the context of the things we want to achieve. If it's giving back to the community, if it's corporate responsibility, if it's technical debt we need to repay, if it's engineering excellence we want to achieve. We say we're only 1% done. So I urge you to think, is there 1% you can contribute back to making open source more sustainable? It is a difficult operation. So many important projects are running on open source technology. Some of them are projects that don't have a viable commercial model around them, and every bit helps. Because how do you want this to play out? Do you want us to move back light years in history and progress and innovation and see closed source, monolithic, proprietary stacks sitting on the Iron Throne? Or do we want to see excellent, open source, innovative technology sitting on the Iron Throne? One misconception I want to debunk is that there are plenty of ways to get involved in open source without being an engineer. I am not an engineer, but I foster communities to come together for information sharing, for problem solving, for collaboration, to not have to reinvent the wheel, to learn from others. That's an important thing in the context of open source. You can contribute to documentation. You can answer questions on Stack Overflow. You can just be a human being. Be an evangelist. Support open source projects, be thankful, be appreciative for everything that they do to sustain these projects, because that's the only incentivization they get. It's that intrinsic motivator, that thankfulness, that's the only thing that they are looking for in order to continue sustaining these projects. And even something as silly as stars on GitHub, it just gives motivation to keep doing the work. And it's a lot of work. I like to give a shout out to Daniel Steinberg, the writer of curl, another project that is not really sustainable by any commercial model. He was recently recognized by the Swedish government, given a very prestigious prize called the Polems Prize. So let's put our hands together for Daniel Steinberg, writer of curl, that we probably all use all the time. He is a great success. I want to say a big thanks to everyone supporting open source projects. And some suggested reading. These are the different articles that I read in order to put together this talk. I think it's important that we all just take a minute and read what's involved with maintaining open source projects. Read this Roads and Bridges, the Unseen Labor Behind Our Digital Infrastructure. Even read books like Walk Away to understand what the world could look like if there was an open source technology. I run DevOps Days Tel Aviv. You are all welcome to submit talks. It's going to be December 18th, 19th this year in Tel Aviv. The call for papers will open soon. Come one, come all. You are all welcome. And I also want to give a shout out to AppsFlyer, the company I work for that enables me to come and speak at these events. We're hiring. We're always hiring. Awesome company. Grazie. Thank you so much.